Big Medicine by Louis L'Amour. Old Billy Dunbar was down flat on his face in a dry wash, swearing into his beard. The best gold-bearing gravel he'd found in a year, and then the Apaches would have to show up. It was like them, the mean, ornery critters. He hugged the ground for dear life and hoped they would not see him, tucked away as he was between some stones where an eddy of the water that once ran through the wash had dug a trench between the stones. There were 9 of them, not many, but enough to take his scalp if they found him. And it'd be just as bad if they saw his burrows or any of the prospect holes he'd been sinking. He was sweating like a stuck hog bleeds lying there with his beard in the sand and the old Sharps 50 ready beside him. He wouldn't have much of a chance if they found him, slithery fighters like they were. But if that old Sharps threw down on him, he'd take at least one along to the happy hunting grounds with him. He could hear them now moving along the desert above the wash. Where in the tarnation were they going? He wouldn't be safe as long as they were in the country, and this was country where not many white men came, and those few who did come were just as miserable to run into as the Apaches. Now, the Apache leader was a lean, muscled man with a hawk nose, and all of them slim and brown without much meat on them, the way Apaches were, and wearing nothing but breechcloths and headbands. He lay perfectly still. Old Billy was too knowing in Indian ways to start moving until he was sure they were gone. He lay right there for almost a half hour after he had last heard them, and then he came out of it cautious as a bear reaching for a honey tree. And when he got to his feet, he hightailed it for the edge of the wash and took a look, and the Apaches had vanished. And he turned and went down the wash, taking his time and keeping the old Sharps handy. It was a mile to his burrows and to the place where his prospect holes were. Luckily, he had 'em back in a draw where there wasn't much chance of 'em being found. Billy Dunbar pulled his old gray felt hat down a little tighter and hurried on. And Jenny and Julie were waiting for him, standing head to tail so they could brush flies off each other's noses. And when he got to them, he gathered up his tools and took them back up the draw to the rocks at the end. His canteens were full, and he had plenty of grub and ammunition. He was lucky that he hadn't shot that rabbit when he saw it, and the Apaches would have heard the bellow of the old Sharps and come for him, sure. He was going to have to be careful. If they just kill a man, it wouldn't be so bad, but these Apaches, they like to stake a man out on an anthill and let the hot sun and ants do it for him. Maybe the buzzards, if they got there soon enough. Now, this wash looked good, too, not only because water had run there, but because it was actually cutting into the edge of the old riverbed. If he could sink a couple of holes down to bedrock, he'd bet there'd be gold and gold aplenty. And when he awakened in the morning, he took a careful look around his hiding place. One thing, the way he was located, if they caught him in camp, they wouldn't get at him to do much. The hollow was perhaps 60 feet across, but over half of it was covered by shelving rock from above, and the cliff ran straight up from there for an easy 50 feet. And there was water in the spring, and enough grass to last the burros for quite some time. And after careful scouting around, he made a fire of dead mesquite, which made almost no smoke, and fixed some coffee. When he had eaten, Dunbar gathered up his pan, pick, shovel, and rifle, and moved out. He was loaded more than he liked, but it couldn't be helped. The place he had selected to work was the inside of the little desert stream. The stream took a bend and left a gravel bank on the inside of the elbow. The gravel looked good. Putting his Sharps down within easy reach, old Billy got busy. Before sundown, he'd moved a lot of dirt and tried several pans, loading them up and going over to the stream. And holding the pan under the water, he began to stir the gravel, breaking up the lumps of clay and stirring till every piece was wet. And then he picked out the larger stones and pebbles and threw them to one side. He put his hands on opposite sides of the pan and began to oscillate it vigorously underwater, moving it in a circular motion so the contents were shaken from side to side. With a quick glance to make sure there were no Apaches in sight, he tipped the pan slightly to an angle of about 30 degrees so the lighter sands, already buoyed up by the water, could slip out over the side. He struck the pan several good blows to help settle the gold, if any, and then dipped for more water and continued the process. He worked steadily at the pan, with occasional glances around until all the refuse had washed over the side but the heavier particles. And then with a little clean water he washed the black sand and gold into another pan, which he took from the brush where it had been concealed the day before. For some time he worked steadily, and then as the light was getting bad, he gathered up his tools and, concealing the empty pan, carried the other with him back up the wash and to his hideout. And he took his sharps and he crept out of the hideout up the wall of the canyon. The desert was still and empty on every side. Too empty, darn it. Them Injuns will be back. You can't fool an Apache. Rolling out of his blankets at sunup, he prepared a quick breakfast and then went over his takings of the day with a magnet. The black sand was mostly particles of magnetite, ilmenite, and black magnetic iron oxide. And what he couldn't draw off, he next eliminated by using a blowbox. It's too slow with them Apaches around. A man working down there can maybe do 60, 70 pans a day in that sort of gravel, but watching for Injuns ain't going to help much. And yet he worked steadily, and by nightfall, despite interruptions, he had handled more than 50 pans. When the second day was over, he grinned at the gold he had. It was sufficient color to show he was on the right track. And right here, by using a rocker, he could have made it pay, but he wasn't looking for peanuts. Again, he cached his tools along with the empty pan and the brush at the edge of the wash. When morning came, he rolled out and was just coming out of the hideout when he saw the Apache. He was squatted in the sand staring at something, and despite his efforts to keep his trail covered, Dunbar had a good idea what that something would be, and he drew back into the hideout. Lying on his middle, he watched the Indian get to his feet and start working downstream. And when he got there a little further, he was going to see those prospect holes, and there'd be nothing Dunbar could do then, nor was there anything he could do now. So far as he could see, only one Apache had found him, and if he fired to kill the Indian, the others would be aware of the situation and come running. Old Billy squinted his eyes and pondered the question. He had a hunch that Indian wasn't going to go for help. He was going to try to get Dunbar by himself so he could take his weapons and whatever else he had of value. The Indian went downstream further and slipped out of sight, and Billy instantly ducked out into the open and scooted down the canyon into the mesquite. He dropped flat down there and inched along in the direction the Indian had gone. He was creeping along, getting nearer and nearer to his prospect holes, when suddenly instinct or the subconscious hearing of a sound warned him. And like a flash, he rolled over, just in time to see the Indian leap at him, knife in hand. Now, Billy Dunbar was no longer a youngster, but he had lived a life in the desert, and he was as hard and tough as whalebone. As the Apache leaped, he caught the knife wrist in his left hand and stabbed the Indian's ribs with his own knife. The Apache twisted away, and Billy gave a heave. The Indian lost balance, and they rolled over and then fell over an 8-foot bank into the wash. Luck was with Billy. The Indian hit first, and Billy's knife arm was around him with the point gouging at the Indian's back. And when they landed, the knife went to the hilt. Billy rolled off, grasping for breath. Hurriedly, he glanced around, and there was no one in sight. Swiftly, he clawed at the bank, causing the loosened gravel to cave down, and in a few minutes of hot, sweating work, the Indian was buried. Turning, Billy lit out for his hideaway, and when he made it, he lay there gasping for breath, his sharps ready. There would be no work this day. He was going to lie low and watch. And the other Indians would come looking, he knew. After dark, he slipped out and covered the Indian better, and then he used a mesquite bush to wipe out as well as possible the signs of their fighting. Then he cat-footed it back to the hollow and tied a rawhide string across the entrance with a can of loose pebbles at the end to warn him if Indians found him. And then he went to sleep. At dawn, he was up. He checked the sharps and then cleaned his .44 again, and he loaded his pockets with cartridges just in case and settled down for a day of it. Luckily, he had shade. It was hot out there, plenty hot. You could fry an egg on those rocks by 10 in the morning. Not that he had any eggs. He hadn't even seen an egg since the last time he was in Fremont, and that'd been 4 months ago. He bit off a chew of tobacco and rolled it in his jaw, and then he studied the banks of the draw. An Apache could move like a ghost and look like part of the landscape, and he had known them to come within 15 feet of a man in grassy country without being seen, and not tall grass at that. It wouldn't be so bad if his time hadn't been so short. When he left Fremont, Sally had 6 months to go to pay off the loan on a ranch, or out she'd go. Sally's husband had been killed by Bronc down on the Sandy. She was alone with the kids, and that loan about to take their home away. And when the situation became serious, old Billy thought of this wash. Once, several years before, he'd washed out some color there, and it looked rich. He'd left the country about 2 jumps ahead of the Apaches and swore he'd never come back. Nobody else was coming out of here with gold either, so he knew it was still like he remembered. Several optimistic prospectors had tried it and were never heard of again. However, old Billy had decided to take a chance. After all, Sally was all he had, and those 2 grandchildren of his deserved a better chance than they'd get if she lost the place. So the day moved along, a story told by the shadows on the sides of the wash. You could almost tell the time of those shadows. It wasn't long before Dunbar knew every bush, every clump of greasewood and mesquite along its length, and every rock. He wiped the sweat from his brow and waited. Sally was a good girl. Pretty, too. Too pretty to be a widow at 22. It was almost mid-afternoon when his questing eye halted suddenly on the bank of the wash, and he lay perfectly still, eyes studying the bank intently. And yet his eyes had moved past the spot before they detected something amiss. He scowled, trying to remember, and then it came to him. There had been a torn place there, as though somebody had started to pull up a clump of greasewood and then abandoned it, and the earth had been exposed and a handful of roots. Now it was slotted out. Straining his eyes, he could see nothing and distinguish no contours that seemed human, only that the spot was no longer visible. The spot was mottled by shadows and sunlight through the leaves of the bush. And then there was movement, so slight that his eyes scarcely detected it. And suddenly the earth and torn roots were visible again. They had come back, and their stealth told him they knew he was somewhere nearby. And the logical place for him would be right where he was. Now he was in for it. Luckily, he had food and water and ammunition. There should be just 8 of them, unless more had come. Probably they'd found his prospect holes and trailed him back this way. And there was no way they could see into his hollow, no way they could shoot into it except through the narrow entrance, which was rock and brush. There was no concealed approach to it. He dug into the bank a little to get more earth in front of himself. No one needed to warn him of the gravity of the situation. It was 150 miles to Fremont and 60 miles to the nearest white man, young Sid Barton, a cowhand-turned-rancher who had started running some cattle on the edge of the Apache country. And nor could he expect help. Nobody ever came into this country, and nobody knew where he was but Sally, and she only knew in a general way. Prospectors did not reveal locations where they had found color. Well, he wasn't one of those restless young coots who'd have to be out there tangling with the Apaches. He could wait. And he would wait in the shade while they were in the sun. Night didn't worry him much. Apaches had never cared for night fighting, and he wouldn't have much trouble with them. One of them showed himself suddenly, only one arm and a rifle, but he fired, the bullet striking the rock overhead. Old Billy chuckled. "Trying to draw fire to get me located." Billy Dunbar waited, grinning through his beard. There was another shot, and then more stillness. He lay absolutely still. A hand showed, and then a foot. He rolled his quid in his jaw, and he spit. An Indian suddenly showed himself and then vanished as though he'd never been there. Old Billy watched the banks cynically. An Indian showed again, and hesitated briefly this time. But Dunbar waited. Suddenly, within 20 feet of the spot where Dunbar lay, an Indian slid down the bank and with a shrill whoop darted for the entrance to the hideaway. It was point blank, even though a moving target, and Billy let him have it. The old Sharps bellowed like a stricken bull and leaped in his hands. The Apache screamed wildly and topped over backward, carried off his feet by the sheer force of the heavy caliber bullet. Yells of rage greeted the shot. Dunbar could see the Indian's body sprawled under the sun. He picked up an edged piece of white stone and made a straight mark on the rock wall beside him, then 7 more. He drew a diagonal line through the first one. 7 to go. A hail of bullets began kicking sand and dirt up around the opening, and one shot hit overhead and showered dirt down almost in his face. "Darn you." Billy took his hat off and laid it beside him, and his 6-shooter atop of it, ready to hand. No more Indians showed themselves, and the day drew on. It was hot out there. In the vast, brassy vault of the sky, a lone buzzard wheeled. He tried no more shots. He waited. They were trying to tire him out. Doggone it, in this place he could outwait all the Apaches in the Southwest. Not that he wanted to. Keeping well below the bank, he got hold of a stone about the size of his head and rolled it into the entrance. Instantly, a shot smacked the dirt below it and kicked dirt into his eyes. And he wiped them and swore viciously. And then he got another stone and rolled that in place, pushing dirt up behind them. And he scooped his hollow deeper and peered thoughtfully at the banks of the draw. Jenny and Julie were eating grass, undisturbed and unworried. They'd been with old Billy too long to be disturbed by these, to them, meaningless fusses and fights. And the shadow from the west bank reached further toward the east, and old Billy waited and watched. He detected an almost indiscernible movement atop the bank, in the same spot where he had first seen an Indian. Taking careful aim, he drew a bead on the exposed roots and waited. He saw no movement, nothing. And yet suddenly he focused his eyes more sharply and saw the roots were no longer exposed. Nestling the stock against his shoulder, his finger eased back on the trigger. The old Sharps wavered, and he waited. The rifle steadied, and he squeezed again. The gun jumped suddenly, and there was a shrill yell from the Apache, who lunged to full height and rose on his tiptoes, both hands clasping his chest. The stricken redskin then plunged face forward down the bank in a shower of gravel, and Billy reloaded and waited. The Apache lay still, lying in the shadow below the bank, and after watching him for a few minutes, alternating between the still form and the banks to the draw, Dunbar picked up his white stone and marked another diagonal white mark across the second straight line. He stared at the figures with satisfaction. 6 left. He was growing hungry. Jenny and Julie had both decided to lie down and call it a day. As luck would have it, his shovel and pick were concealed in the brush at the point where the draw opened into the wider wash. He scanned the bank suddenly and then drew back. Grasping a bush, he pulled it from the earth under the huge rocks. He then took the brush and some stones and added to his parapet. With some lumps of earth and rock, he gradually built it stronger. Always he returned to the parapet, but the Apaches were cautious, and he saw nothing of them. And yet his instinct told him they were there, somewhere. And that, he knew, was the trouble. It was the fact he'd been avoiding ever since he'd holed up for the fight. They'd always be around somewhere now. 3 of their braves were missing, dead, and they would never let him leave the country alive. If he had patience, so had they, and they could afford to wait, and he could not. It was not merely a matter of getting home before the 6-month period was up, and less than 2 months remained of that. It was a matter of getting home with enough money to pay off the loan. And with the best of luck, it would require weeks upon weeks of hard, uninterrupted work. And then he saw the wolf. It was no more than a glimpse, and a fleeting glimpse. Billy Dunbar saw the sharply pointed nose and bright eyes, and then the swish of a tail. The wolf vanished somewhere at the base of the shelf of the rock that shaded the pocket. It vanished in proximity to the spring. Old Billy frowned and studied the spot. He wasn't the only one holed up here. The wolf evidently had a hole somewhere in the back of the pocket, and perhaps some young, as the time of the year was right. His stillness after he had finished work on the entrance had evidently fooled the wolf into believing the white man was gone. Obviously the wolf had been lying there, waiting for him to leave so it could come out and hunt. The cubs would be getting hungry, if there were cubs. The idea came to him then, an idea utterly fantastic, yet one that suddenly made him chuckle. It might work. It could work. At least it's worth a chance. Somehow, someway, I got to be rid of those Apaches. And Billy knew something of their superstitions and their beliefs, and it was a gamble, but as suddenly as he conceived the idea, he knew it was a chance, and he was going to take it. Digging his change of clothes out of the saddlebags, he got into them, and then he took his old clothing and laid it out on the ground in plain sight. The pants, then the coat, the boots, and nearby the hat. And taking some sticks, he went to the entrance of the wolf den and built a small fire close by. And then he hastily went back and took a quick look around. The draw was empty, but he knew the place was watched. He went back and got out a line of the wolf den and waited. The smoke was slight, but it was going into the den. It wouldn't take long. Suddenly the wolf came out with a rush, ran to the middle of the pocket, took a quick snarling look around, and then went over the parapet and down the draw. Working swiftly, Billy moved the fire and scattered a few sticks and coals in his other fireplaces, and then he brushed the ground with a branch. It would be a few minutes before the Apaches moved, and perhaps longer. Crawling into the wolf den, he found it empty. There were no cubs. He gathered some wolf hair, which he gathered up and took back to his clothing, and he put some of the hair in his shirt and some near his pants. A quick look down the draw showed no sign of an Indian, but that they had seen the wolf he knew, and he could picture their surprise and puzzlement. Hurrying to the spring, he dug from the bank near the water a large quantity of mud. This was an added touch, but one that might help. And from the mud he formed 2 roughly human figures. About the head of each he tied a blade of grass. Hurrying to the parapet for a stolen look down the draw, he worked until 6 such figures were made. And then, using thorns and some old porcupine quills he found near a rock, he thrust 1 or more through each of the mud figures. They stood in a neat row facing the parapet. Quickly he hurried for one last look into the draw. An Indian had emerged, and he stood there in plain sight, staring toward the place. They would be cautious, Billy knew, and he chuckled to himself as he thought of what was to follow. Gathering up his rifle, the ammunition, a canteen, and a little food, he hurried to the wolf den and crawled back inside. At the end of the den there was room to sit up, topped by the stone of the shelving rock itself. He lighted a match and saw to his right a smaller hole of some sort. Cautiously, Billy crawled back to the entrance, and careful to avoid the wolf tracks and the dust outside, He brushed out his own tracks and then retreated into the depths of the cave. From where he lay, he could see the parapet. Almost a half hour passed before the first head lifted above the poorly made wall. Black, straight hair, a red headband, and then the sharp, hard features of their leader. And then other heads lifted beside him, and one by one the 6 Apaches stepped over the wall and into the pocket. They did not rush, but looked cautiously about, and their eyes were large and frightened. And they looked all around, then at the clothing, and then at the images. One of the Indians grunted and pointed. They drew closer, and then stopped in an awed line, staring at the mud figures. They knew too well what they meant. Those figures meant a witch doctor had put a death spell on each one of them. And one of the Indians drew back and looked at the clothing. Suddenly he gave a startled cry and pointed at the wolf hair, and they gathered around, talking excitingly, and then glancing over their shoulders fearfully. They had trapped what they believed to be a white man, and knowing Apaches, old Billy would have guessed they knew his height, his weight, and approximate age. Those things they could tell from the length of his stride, the way he worked, and the pressure of a footprint in softer ground. They'd trapped a white man, and a wolf had escaped. Now they found his clothing lying here, and on the clothing the hair of a wolf. All Indians knew of wolf men, those weird creatures who changed at will from wolf to man and back again, creatures that could tear the throat from a man while he slept and could mark his children with the wolf blood. The day had waned, and as he lay there, old Billy Dunbar could see that while he had worked, the sun had neared the horizon. The Indians looked around uneasily. This was the den of a wolf man, a powerful spirit who had put the death spell on each one of them, who came as a man and went as a wolf. Suddenly, out on the desert, a wolf howled. The Apaches started as if struck, and then, as a man, they began to draw back, and by the time they reached the parapet, they were hurrying. Old Billy stayed the night in the wolf hole, lying at its mouth, waiting for dawn, and he saw the wolf come back, stare about uneasily, and then go away. And when light came, he crawled from the hole. The burros were cropping grass, and they looked at him, and he started to pick up a pack saddle and then dropped it. I'll be darned if I will. Taking the old sharps and the extra pan, he walked down to the wash and went to work. And he kept a careful eye out, but he saw no Apaches. The goal was panning out even better than he'd dreamed would be possible. A few more days. Suddenly, he looked up. 2 Indians stood in plain sight, facing him. The nearest one walked forward and placed something on a rock, and then drew away. Crouching, waiting, old Billy watched them go. And then he went to the rock, and wrapped in a piece of tan buckskin was a haunch of venison. He was big medicine now. He was Wolfman. The venison was a peace offering, and he would take it. He knew now he'd come and go and pan as much gold as he wanted in the Apache country. And a few days later, he killed a wolf, skinned it, and then buried the carcass. But with the head, he made a cap to fit over the crown of his old felt hat. And wherever he went, he wore it. A month later, walking into Fremont behind the swishing tails of Jenny and Julie, he met Sally at the gate. She was talking with young Sid Barton. "Howdy, Billy," Sid said. Sid was grinning at him, looking at the wolfskin cap. "Better not wear that around here, or somebody might take you for a wolf." "I am." "You're darn right I am. Ask them Apaches."